Okay, so in the reading you have this reference to the subject as having a type of interiority to it. So what it is to be a subject is to have an interior, to have a type of interior existence. What it is to be an object is to have a type of exterior existence, which is why humans are, in a sense, both subjects and objects, right? And especially in virtue of being self-conscious or self-knowers, we're, in some sense, the object of our own subjectivity. We're the object of which the subject, which we are, is attempting to understand. So we sort of can occupy both positions, object and subject. So interiority and exteriority. This made me think about this passage in Aquinas, in Summa Contra Gentiles, where he distinguishes being. He says being can be distinguished according to the level of interiority that it has, the level of its he doesn't say interior life, because life is kind of a technical term, but in an analogous sense, it's in the degree to which it has an interior life is a way of ordering being. Being can be ordered in virtue of how interior its existence is. So he begins. This is Summa Contra Gentiles 4:11. Different kinds of things produce in different ways, those on a higher level producing in a more interior way. And then he begins and he goes through this kind of ladder. On the lowest level, there are non-living bodies, and he says, and all that they can do, all these elements, basically, all that they can do is they can interact. And so basically what it is, the type of action they do is almost just a purely external type of action. They don't really take anything in. But he does, at a little point of reference, they can take in one sense. Namely, this mug that's on the table can take in the activity of another. I mean, if I push it, in some sense, it's responding to, and so it's sort of internalizing my activity, but in a very external way. It's a very external way of internalizing or receiving. You could talk about receiving my activity. Does that make sense? So at that pure brute level of just dumb matter, even though in a sense no matter is dumb because there's always a sense of receptivity, even if it's at that lowest level, right? And so there's not much of an interior existence to non-living bodies. Plants, he goes on to say, have a type of interiority that they can internalize the external world. Now, plants do that in still an external-ish type of way, through the roots, through the absorption of the photons or whatever in the photosynthesis process. It takes in the external world, and so there's a type of internalization of being that's occurring there, which is a more internal. There's more internal space in the existence of a plant than there is in a rock, right? It can take in more, is another way to put it. He goes on to say, but this is not perfect, because still, with the plant, everything that it internalizes, it's still the case that the reason it internalizes all of this external stuff is for the sake of outputting, external action. It's for the sake of producing seed or reproducing, right? So it's the reason it takes the world in is for the sake of spitting it back out in a new form, right? So its internal existence is still ordered towards the external, but it's still a higher degree. The next, he talks about animals, and I mean this is literally a stage, ladder process that Balthasar talks about on. Does anyone remember where this is? This is 45 page, or you don't get pages. Sorry. This is I don't know, just a little bit into the subject section. So a couple paragraphs in, 1, 2, 3, like the fourth paragraph in. I'll try to correlate page numbers, and then we'll just paginate the whole thing so we can all track stuff. Okay, so But this is right there, right? He begins with stones. I mean, he just uses the exact same examples that Aquinas is using here. Stones, and then he talks about their interiority, he moves to plants, then he moves to animals. But animals have an interior existence, namely there's a domain of interiority. They're more of a subject, right? This is another way to put this is it's degrees of subjectivity. The rocks are in a sense subjects because they kind of can receive objects. Plants are more of a subject because they can receive objects in a more internal way. The receptivity is at a higher level. Animals can receive objects at an even higher level. So there's a more internal or interior existence, and that's in virtue of sensation, right? So perception or sensation is a way of internalizing the object. And then he says, Aquinas talks about this, but still at that level, you have a sense that the internalization at the animal level is for the sake of the external. In a way, it's a sensing which has its end in external activity. The lion wants to know where the zebra is going, not just to take the zebra in as a moving being, but to take the zebra in as a moving being for the sake of it having lunch, right? So the external action is still the end of the internalization. But it's not until you get to self-conscious beings at the level of like the rational human agent where you get the ability to internalize the world, internalize the objects. There's a broader space there, and it's not necessarily the case that it results in an external product, right? The point of knowing isn't necessarily something external, and so the internalization or the receptivity of the object in a knower, a rational knower, is a way not of trying to produce something that's external, but it's a way of making the object, producing in a sense or reproducing the object in the subject, in the subjective way, as known now. The object becomes now a known object. And that is that's a higher form of the object existing. Just as this is another thing he talks about following Aristotle's De Anima, but it's the color is potentially seen, and then it's fulfilled or perfected in the eye, right? I mean, the color is perfected in the eye of being actually seen. And so there's this sense that the subjectivity and the on the level of being receptive is a perfecter or a fulfiller of the object. You can have a conversation with a rock, but the conversation doesn't mean as much as it would if you were having that conversation with someone who could listen, someone who could actually receive it. It actually isn't a real conversation if the rock is your audience, because the rock isn't receiving it. So there's something about a speech can't be given to an empty room, right? You can mimic a speech, but it's not a real. You're not giving a speech if there aren't listeners. Just as you're not teaching. This is another thing Aquinas talks about. You're not teaching if there aren't students, right? So if all of you checked out, hopefully you're not doing this, but if all of you completely checked out and you said, "Nah, I'm done with this whole like thinking thing, this philosophy thing. I want no more part of this," and you just checked out, which I have seen before, but not in this class. And if that were the case, then I would cease to be an actual teacher. I would become a mere potential teacher. I could teach, but I wouldn't be actually teaching, because to be actually teaching would be that you would actually be receiving what I'm saying, right? Does that sort of make sense? And so the whole the whole drama of this section, the whole thesis of this section, is to try to show that truth, and I think it's a fairly Thomistic thing, that truth, in virtue of being something like knowability, is maybe another way to think of it, whereas good might be something like desirability. So it's good in one sense. Maybe you can describe it as corresponding most to the will, whereas truth corresponds most to the intellect, whereas goodness is the desirability of things. Truth is the knowability of things, and so it's like you get this parallel, and the way in which things are known to be true is the way in which things are knowable, and things are knowable and perfected in their knowability, that is, perfected in their truth, in virtue of being actually known, just as goods are perfected in being actually willed and received, or sought or desired or what have you, or willed, right? That corresponds, I think, also with the truth, and so you get this interesting interrelationship occurring between the subject and the object in such a way that it doesn't make sense, in virtue of what truth means, to think about subjects and objects as apart from each other. Just as it doesn't really make sense to think about what the good means apart from willing or beings that desire or move towards, right? So the good is the end towards which things move, and so the good in a sense is like bound up with being desirable, right? And so I think you can't really separate the good from the which you could think of as the object, from the subject, which is the seekers of the good. In an analogous way, you can't separate the true, which is like in a sense the object, from the seekers of the good, which is the subject. But it's not. It's probably best to say that the true isn't simply just the object, but it's the interrelationship between the two. Just as love, which is the act of willing the good, isn't so much the end itself, but it's the interrelationship between the will and the end, right? That's what love is. It's not the one or the other, but it's like what occurs between the two. Okay, so I mean that's sort of a very rough, quick overview of what's going on in here, and we can work through it in a slower way. But I want to open up to if you have any questions, things that struck you about what's going on here, how truth is characterized, right? And the whole point of this being about truth is it's a reflection on the relationship between the subject and the object. That's where truth finds its meaning. It finds its logos in the relationship between subject and object. So any comments about that or thoughts about that? So I guess final point, as objectivity, or you could put it as being, increases in perfection, that is to say the external gets more and more perfected, the internal would have to correspond with that to get more and more perfected, and so there's not like an external perfection that doesn't correspond to the ability for an internal reception of that. That's like what goes hand in hand, right? And ultimately, culminating in, he says, God as a self-knower. God isn't just pure being, but pure being comes to be a pure knowing, right? So you could say the perfection isn't simply just this being, but it's a knowing. It's a knowing that's a being, and so you don't want to separate knowing and being in God. And I think what he's trying to say is all of the created world, the limited world, participates in that union of being and knowing. Just at different degrees, right? I mean, that's just different degrees of uniting subject and object. Subject and object is united perfectly in God, and then you get lesser participations of that in creation. Any comments or thoughts about any of these passages or parts from the reading? We'll just see.
Is it just reception of like how the thing actually is? I feel like truth is nothing. I feel like it just is receptivity.
I think that's true. Truth is receptivity in a way, but I think the real question is, what does it mean to be receptive? That's, I think, what's at stake. It's like, here's a concrete example. Maybe you've perhaps sat through a class. For me, this is more like faculty meetings or something, where you are tempted to become just this passive recipient. You're just thinking that what your role here is just to record what's being said, and you might think that's what it is to know. It's just to receive. In a way, that's true, but reception has to correspond to like what's being given. So it's analogous to saying that the matter must be receptive of the form. If you have a bunch of wood and you're going to build a play set out of that wood, the wood in a sense needs to be receptive of the form of a play set. If the wood's all brittle and rotting and everything, you could kind of force a play set out of it, but it's not really going to last. In a sense, it might not even be a true play set if once you get it kind of all balanced up and you go and try to climb the ladder to slide down the slide and it falls on you. Right? It's not receptive of the form. It's kind of like, oh, okay, I know all this stuff that Aquinas is saying. It's like the problem isn't so much in the form. It's in how it was received, and so then it's like you go to climb the ladder of Thomistic thought, and it's if you just received it in a purely structural way, it almost doesn't mean anything, right? And I think what Balthasar is trying to do here is he's trying to use this idea of truth is the subject's reception of the object, but it's a reception that is at once spontaneous, meaning it's something the subject has to do, and on the other hand, or at the other time, it's the sense of receptivity. It's something the object has to do, and so he's trying to show that to receive something which is to be passive actually is a type of action. He says this on I won't give you a page because that'll just taunt you. I know it's the paragraph that begins with somewhat in the middle of the section, the subject section. The paragraph that begins with, the truth of another has to be received in the readiness of total indifference. So the truth of another has to be received in the readiness of total indifference, which, as such, is pure potency. So the knower kind of has to say, I need to get out of the way. I need to step out of the way in one sense. I don't want to read into this, and this is something that this is typically the worry that people have with the Kantian transcendental idealism, which is in virtue of the transcendental aesthetic, and then the transcendental analytic, you get this. It looks like the human is reading into the objects, right? We're imparting form on the object, and it looks like what Balthasar is trying to say is there is a sense in which there needs to be, we're not imparting anything on the object, That is, we're not contributing and adding things. So there's a way in which the knower has a type of pure potency. The intellect, the passive intellect, needs to be as he says at the end of that paragraph, a spiritual matter, right? But he goes on. On the other hand, because this potency entails capability for every cognition, it is through active potency. So this pure potency is a type of active potency, which is a strange paradox.
But it makes sense to say that in a way, like receptivity is also sort of giving, because it's like giving of itself to be fully affected by its impact.
Yeah. I think one way to give to my children is to receive their drawings that might not initially seem to be worthwhile, but right. I mean, I think this is a good example. If you sort of judged what it was for someone to give you a good drawing, and you had this concept of what a good drawing really meant, and you kind of had this kind of flat view of a picture, like what the meaning of a drawing is, and then you had your kid give you this drawing. You could only fake gratitude, right? You could only fake it. Like, now, I think what's at stake here is there's another way of receiving which perfects the drawing as a drawing. Like the whole meaning of a drawing, and specifically as a drawing as a gift to someone, to give to someone like that, is to communicate something, to convey something. And the way that's received, I think perfects what that drawing as a gift is, and so so I think it's an act of charity in many senses, to receive the gift that someone gives, and it perfects it from a lowly being of a half mangled Christmas tree that's supposed to be a picture of the post office. You're like, wait, it's supposed to be a post office. Why does it look like a Christmas tree? And you can it gets perfected as a drawing, interestingly, by being received well. And I think that is that's sort of what he's up to, because he goes on. This is a good point. He goes on with, so I'll just read from where we left off. It has nothing to do with the slack malleability of matter, which, having no will of its own, is open to taking on whatever form another's will may choose to impose upon it. So this was like the wood of a playset. You can kind of force the form onto the wood of a playset, and it can kind of hold that form for a certain while. But even in that case, I think it might have been worth drawing out that even in that case, the matter can't really receive the form if it's not in some innate way disposed to it. You can't give Jell-O the form of, Barack Obama or something. It can hold the form for a little while, but it's like Jell-O's just not the sort of thing that can really depict Barack Obama, right? Jell-O can't take on the form of a knife. I don't know why I thought of it. Okay. Right. So Jell-O can't take on the form of a knife either. Right. This is a fairly classical principle, that the matter must be receptive of the form. But it's no just mere. And here's what he's sort of drawing out about this. It's not just a mere brute, dumb, receptivity or malleability. He goes on. No, the indifference of this active potency is a readiness to spring into action wherever the subject's self-display might send or employ it. Like a servant, it awaits the master's command. So the knower is like a servant of the object. The subject is a servant of the object. And so rather than thinking of like the subject's concepts and the subject's mental cognitive structures as a way of imposing itself onto the object in order to like grasp it, it's a way of trying to let the object speak at a higher level that it can't speak at a cognitive conscious level, right? And this is, he goes on at one point to talk about things that aren't conscious can enter into the world of consciousness through knowing, through knowledge, right? And so it says this is like the model of knowing. It's a servant awaits the master's command, and it neither knows in advance where the master will send it, nor calculates beforehand how it is going to execute the command. Right. So in a way, this is a slight departure, I think, from Kant, who is real. I mean, a lot of this is Kantian in one sense, but it's also I think a corrective or a departure from Kant, because it's saying Kant gives fairly strict articulations, limitations on how knowing must occur, how the human mind must receive the object. And now there's perhaps fruit in thinking about that, and maybe there's something fruitful in recognizing how the human does receive it. But I think what Balthasar is trying to say, following the tradition, is what truth requires is something more like in the Socratic method, which is an unknowing of where exactly this is leading. And without that unknowing where this is leading, you can't have truth, because otherwise you would stand apart from truth or before truth and say, I know where this is going, so it's almost as if I don't need to know this now. I know the point of this, so I don't need to listen to Jaeger ramble on about things. To take yourself to already know something means you don't need to know it, right? And so you've sort of destroyed truth. And so it's only in light of something like an unknowability that you can see yourself as he uses that term in a sort of a beautiful way, as a servant, right? Does that make sense? What he says on the previous page, the paragraph before, it's a long paragraph, so it's just the one paragraph before that, I think corresponds to this idea, and he draws out this through the terminology of love, which I think is important if you want to track philosophy back to its roots, even its etymological roots, right? It's a love, right? It's ultimately a type of love. And so knowing has to be seen on the model of a loving. And this is why I'm always drawn to Platonic philosophies, because it recognizes that fact, that the philosopher, the knower, is first and foremost a type of lover. But here's the way that Balthasar puts this at the very beginning of that passage. Increased spontaneity thus brings increasingly perfect receptivity. The degree to which you are capable of contributing, the more you know that you can contribute to, say, a reading of a particular book, the more, it's not like the less receptive you need to be now. It's like, okay, I know all this stuff, so I don't need to be really receptive to Homer or to whatever, because I know all this stuff already. It's like the more you know, the more it's now capable, or the more you're now capable of receiving what you would otherwise have not been capable of receiving. So that maps onto, I think, why for the tradition, wisdom was a type of ignorance. It's to know things is to be able to open yourself up to receive more than you otherwise couldn't, which means it's at the service of this openness, which is a type of ignorance of what you don't have. Okay, so he goes on. To put it in other terms, increased self-determination implies a correlative increase in the opportunity and the capacity to let oneself be determined by another. So this is like to know the truth is to let yourself be determined by the truth, which is not something that you can just do mindlessly. You have to deliberately, intentionally let yourself be determined by the truth. You can sit in a classroom that Jager's teaching and say, okay, Jager, make me know. And I can't make you know. You've got to do it yourself. What I can do is I can help you to help yourself. Now that's probably not the best way to put it, but I can do things, but it's always going to be you that has to, in one sense, take the initiative to make yourself receptive of the truth. He goes on. The passivity presupposed here is of a piece with the inmost freedom of the spirit, which resolves in the freedom of love, to let itself be freely determined in love. Right, so it's sort of a love of the object, which also requires a humility before the object, that makes the knower capable of being formed by the object. It makes the subject capable of, so to receive the object is to be formed by it, to be determined by it. So in a sense, to judge something is always to let that thing have the first say, which is to be judged by it, which is the cool thing he's doing at the very end of the section. The measure by which we measure is measured unto us, which I think is really, he's putting this in like an epistemic context, which is a real crazy thing to do. But I mean, crazy in like an awesome way. Okay, but here's where I think this really takes on light, at least for me. Okay, he goes on. We have to proceed with extreme care in applying the concept of act and potency to this reality. The reality of love, precisely when love is perfect, runs counter to any high-handed anticipation of the truth of one's thou. It's as if you have to resist the pre-thought that you already know what you're going to receive. Because otherwise it's not really truth that you're looking for. It's like ideology. I'm looking for what I already know. I'm looking to be confirmed in what I already think. And that's not a pursuit of truth. It's actually a pursuit of one's own ideas, and it's more sophistical than it is philosophical. Rather, it is part of love's very constitution to wish genuinely and unfeignedly to receive every gift of this thou as a new, truly enriching wonder. Love would gladly give up a great deal of what it knows if it could thereby receive it anew from the beloved. So this is like the Socratic attitude of being able to set out again as a way of not just like demonstrating, but enacting, participating in the love for wisdom. Right. This is the philosopher in some very real sense is the person who's always open to setting out again, starting again on the pursuit of wisdom. Doesn't mean you simply negate all that's known. So this is not like a type of skepticism, a starting over in a skeptical way, but it's a starting over in the sense that to know always opens to knowing more, but not in a quantitative way. He talks about this, right? It's not like a quantitative knowing more. Okay, and so this is the disposition or the attitude of the knower's receptivity or the subject's receptivity of the object. Right. Indeed, it would happily perform the miracle of unknowing things that it knows in order to be able to receive them anew as a gift of the beloved. Right, and that seems to be the mark of wisdom, and that's why philosophy, as he references earlier, is just simply the sort of the act of the pursuit of the reason's pursuit of knowing the truth is really a pursuit of God ultimately, right? And you pursue God through love, and there's different forms that love can take, but in this context, in like an epistemic context, it takes the form of knowledge, of knowing through truth, right? So truth starts to take on this semblance of love. Does that make sense? I think it makes sense. But comments or questions about that? That's the sense in which to receive something requires that you do something. You can't pay a bunch of money to go to college to receive an education and think that you're just gonna, like, as they say, sit through it and like, you know, just passively take it in as if you could, like, open up the cupboard and put the groceries in and then close the cupboard. Right? There's you've got to consume it. You've got to eat the groceries before you get nourished by it, right? To carry the analogy on. I don't know. I think it's a really interesting. It's an interesting way of framing knowledge, the subject's knowledge of the object, that really preserves the subjectivity that Kant is really wanting to have, right? I mean, I think Kant is right about this, that there's something that the subject plays a role in knowing. The subject plays a role in knowing, and therefore in truth, right? Truth as knowability, right? It's linked up with the subject. But it makes that role that the subject plays not a determining role that carries with it the threat of pure subjectivity, such that the object gets reduced to the subject. Because what you see now is the subject's whole function is to be the servant of the object, right? And it's within that context that you see there's not a primacy of object in one way, nor is there a primacy of subject in another way. Both of those would lose the point of truth. Just as in the context of love more broadly, there's not a primacy of the lover to the beloved, because then the lover would be just like, you know, I don't know, a stalker. Someone just looking to take the beloved. And so it's not really that the lover cares about the beloved, it's that the lover just cares about himself, and he's just trying to, like, you know, take the beloved, right? But nor is there a primacy of the beloved over the lover, because then it's as if, like, that's like almost like a self-hatred, like, oh, I all that matters is you and I don't matter at all type of thing. Neither of those really are the context of where love occurs. It's actually somehow there's a double primacy. They both, in some sense, are what matters most. And I think that's what Balthasar is trying to do here with the subject and the object. There's a sense in which they both are the origin in a way, because they each admit that the other is the origin. Right? The subject says the whole reason for my being is the object, and the object says the whole reason for my being is the subject. And it's only in light of that they can be preserved from having that reduction from one to the other. And I think it's within that context that he has at the end that awesome reflection on self-knowledge, knowing oneself. How to put this? Knowing another is modeled after knowing oneself, but it's knowing oneself as already known. So here's how I think this plays itself out. This is in the last few paragraphs of section B. I think this is following a strand of thought that I don't know if it begins with, but it's certainly central to what's going on in Augustine's Confessions, the book on memory. So what it is to exist, in a way, is most fundamentally to be known by God, such that like what existence is primarily is found in God, in like the primal originary sense. Now there's something real about our existence. This is not like a divine idealism. This is why God's knowledge is capable of being a type of creative knowledge. This is that pure spontaneity that we talked about earlier on in the semester in Solace. But the knowledge of God is a knowledge which is capable of creating. And so the being of the creature is most fundamentally united with being a bit of knowledge, if you wanted to put it that way, right? And so it's an existence that is at one and the same time a being known. It's a being that's a being known. That's what you are, right? And so to know yourself, self-knowledge then consists in. This is going to it'd be easier if we could write this out on the board. But the knowing oneself as known by God, right? So that's it's like a knowledge that you're known, and therefore there needs to be this separation. He thinks separation is probably not the best word. There needs to be a distance, a space between you, you and God, because otherwise you collapse into God, and you're not really then something that God knows in a real way. He sort of doesn't give you the space for you to be you. Now that sounds like something you would read on like a motivational poster or something. In like a high school youth group or something. But what I mean is like the threat, as he puts it at the very end, of pantheistic idealism follows on not recognizing the distance between God and what God knows. There's this possibility that what God knows is in some sense other than God. That's what creation is. That God's knowledge can be something other than God, right? It's creative. It bestows the other. It gives the other to itself. He knows in such a way that it gives the other to itself. It gives us our own existence, and so he's trying to say, I think, that is the paradigm on which our knowledge of other objects or of objects gives those objects themselves. It gives them their own being. It gives them the space to be themselves in a way. So that otherwise our knowledge would just be this purely subjective. We link it up simply with our own concepts and our thoughts, and it becomes merely just this figment of our conceptualization. How is it that you can know something in such a way that it doesn't just become your conceptualized idea of it? And I think he's going to say only in light of something like what's happening in God's, the way God knows. The perfection of knowledge is always a knowledge that lets another be another. That's what truth is. It's to let another be another, such that you can then receive it as other than you. And so he's using the model of divine knowledge and specifically knowledge of creation as the way in which we come to know other things. And so I think what we saw in Solace following Kant is not exactly right. That what Kant seems to say is divine knowing is pure spontaneity. And it doesn't, that although that's sort of right, there's something too limiting or too restrictive about that. It's a pure spontaneity that sort of an allowing the other to be other for the sake of now knowing it as a part. And so there is a type of there's a one-way relationship now. God's knowing allows there to be a one-way relationship. It's maybe not that he's related to creation, but it's a knowing that allows things to be related to him. So there's this distance between the two. And so there is an analogous type of receptivity. If you want to talk about creation as an analogous type of causation, if God creates, it's this analogous sense of causing something external. There's going to be an analogous sense in which he's now made himself. No, that's. I don't want to use those terms. I'm speaking too loosely. He's now performed an action which makes him analogously, with a strong emphasis on analogously, receptive of the creation. The creation, in a sense, is now apart from him, and there's this. I'll just call it an analogous like receptivity. He can receive it back is another way to put it. Right, just as creation is an analogous way of talking about him acting and bestowing something else. The opposite or the correlate of that would be the ability to receive it back. So there's an analogous other side of creation. Creation, as you can think of as the outgoing, and then you have this. And so that's the model, I think, of knowing, which doesn't present you with just a flat spontaneity. It's a type of spontaneity that has some interesting analogous sense of receptivity within it. And that I think he's not going to talk about this in this book, but down the road, if you really want to see him like wax and wane about this is where the theological Trinitarian doctrine really comes into play. That the model of knowing in this context is just that God as sort of a unitary creator gets worked in an internal immanent manner within the Trinity, and so there's like an intersubjectivity not just between God and creation, but there's an intersubjectivity perhaps within God himself, right? An intersubjectivity as like an interpersonality. So it's not just pure spontaneity that the Father engages in. So that's sort of why he's doing this whole thing. He's trying to provide an epistemology that makes possible a Trinitarian theology. We're only going to get the epistemology though, so you'll have to go on to get the other stuff if you want.
What's it called?
This is part of a huge series. This is called the Theo-Logic, but it's part of just a gigantic series.